ChristianGeekCentral.com.
Hey everybody, it's Offscreen Kim here with another book review from the Crossover Alliance. This time it's Beast by Mark Carver and Michael Anatra. Guys, I know I took a long time with this review, but that's because I've got such conflicted feelings about Beast. It's amazingly exciting. It's disappointingly mundane. It's piercingly real. It's unashamedly ugly. It caters perfectly to an underserved demographic, and it hopelessly alienates others. It does things I hate, but I can't deny it does them well. Beast is just not the sort of thing that I expected to be reading from the Crossover Alliance. It's kind of like getting a barbecue sandwich when you ordered a burger. It seems like a very well-made barbecue sandwich. Plenty of meat, sharp smoky sauce, probably more expensive and carefully prepared than the cheap cheeseburger you expected. The only problem is, you don't like barbecue. However delicious that sandwich might be rated by 100 other people, to you, it's a disappointment. And that's kind of this book to me. Now, I'm clearly not the target audience for Beast, which may invalidate some or all of my thoughts in the eyes of those who are. That's okay. Unfortunately, I'm the book reviewer this channel has, not the one it might deserve, so I'm going to give it what I've got and do my best to judge Beast for what it is and not what I wanted it to be. Here we go. The premise for this book is as follows. Oil driller Kyle Hamilton has already experienced one brush with death, and he's not eager to go back out on a drilling platform again. But when his wife is diagnosed with cancer, Kyle decides to take a high-paying temporary drilling assignment to pay for her treatment. Whatever hostility, loss, or danger he has to face, and there's plenty, Kyle is determined to accomplish the job and make it back to his family. Now, here's the first thing you need to know about Beast, and what I wished I'd known going in, because it was a big letdown for me. The Crossover Alliance advertises itself as publishing edgy Christian speculative fiction. But with Beast, there is no spec in this fic. None at all. The rig is not haunted. It's not being attacked by angry Atlanteans. It's not built over some sort of magical fault line. It's not a front for alien abductions or mad science experiments. The oil company isn't really harvesting the life force of the workers or making blood sacrifice to the gods of the sea. Exxon Valdez did not delve too greedily and too deep. None of that. It's just a straight-up industrial catastrophe, nothing unnatural added. When I read Beast, I kept waiting and waiting for the speculative twist to be revealed. I held out hope for almost 90 pages before I was forced to admit that there simply wasn't any twist. Again, that's not to say this book is bad, just that it's different from what I expected a Crossover Alliance book to be. I wish I'd known that this book was never meant to be anything but real-world adventure going in, and I think others would prefer to know this as well. If you only want the weird, the strange, and the unnatural, you're not going to find that in Beast. If you're okay without those elements, proceed ahead. Maybe the Crossover Alliance could put some sort of genre designator on the books, similar to their content labeling system, or maybe some sort of genre sorting feature for titles on the website. Just a thought. It does seem like at least part of the problem here is that the Crossover Alliance is operating under a much broader definition of what constitutes speculative fiction than the one I'm familiar with. In the recently released second anthology of theirs, they discussed this in the introduction, saying that speculative fiction is simply fiction that asks the question, what if? Now, not only is that not the way I've seen spec fic defined anywhere else, but every work of fiction runs on the premise, this isn't true, but what if it was? And if all fiction is speculative fiction by that metric, why bother calling it speculative at all? It becomes a useless and redundant word. As far as I can tell, the more common definition of speculative fiction is that it takes place in a world that's fundamentally different from our own. Not necessarily drastically different, but fundamentally so. Fantasy, Sci-fi, supernatural horror, or alternate history, those are speculative fiction because even their near-Earth variants involve things that simply don't happen in the world as we know it. A story that could air in its entirety on the nightly news and shock no one is not speculative fiction. In a video for his fans, Mark Carver refers to Beast as, quote, realistic science fiction, end quote. Now, if you gave me those words without any other context, if you handed me a book and said, here, Kim, read this, it's realistic science fiction, I would think you meant something set in the near future, maybe a generation or two from now, with technology only a few steps beyond what we have today. But that's not what Carver means by those words. He seems to be using them to indicate action movie levels of exaggerated heroism, feats that are 1 in 1,000 attempts. I think he specifically cited incidences like, oh, nobody could actually jump that far, or no one would actually live through that if they tried it, as what he's calling realistic science fiction. Again, I've never heard those terms used in this way before, and I think this redefinition of terms hurts the marketing of the book. I think if the author and the Crossover Alliance were more precise in their terminology and more clear about the genre classification of Beast, this book would be more likely to get into the hands of the people that do want to read it, and less likely to accidentally end up with people that don't. But let's get past what Beast isn't and dig into what it is. And it is definitely chock full of action. Whereas End of the Innocents reminded me of a disaster movie, Beast reads more like a 90s action flick. It's kind of like welding the front half of Armageddon to the back half of Daylight, and it doesn't stint on the literary equivalent of stunt work and pyrotechnics. Carver has a gift for action description, including knowing when to dial back the flash and dazzle and let understatement allow an intense moment to really sink in. The plot here in Beast is very fast-paced. There's a short burst of action to open up, then it pulls back for a little while to give us some establishing moments. But once the story hits the end of the first act, it takes off running and does not stop until the very end. It actually might be a little too fast at times. The breakneck pace doesn't allow for much time to develop characters or ponder themes. It almost feels like Carver is constantly just off page with a whip going, "Yah, characters, yah! No time for introspection, let's move, move, move!" All this action is great for keeping the reader turning the page, but it does involve a lot of circling around and backtracking to keep things in constant motion. Every time the characters reach what should be safety, it turns out to be just another death trap that needs escaping. Kyle starts at point A, hurries to the haven of point B, encounters insurmountable obstacles there, so he goes back through A to C. Then when C proves to not work out so well, he ends up back at B again 60 pages later. It creates this frustrating element to all of Kyle's successes, as the constant moving of the goalposts makes the prior struggles feel a little pointless. One character actually spends most of the time that Kyle and company are running around in a spot somewhere between A and B, and he actually gets by better than they do. And yet, we're supposed to see this character's choices as wrong, and Kyle's is right. More on that later. The action aspects also get a tiny bit repetitive. Kyle seems to have a shocking number of second winds in him. Multiple times he collapses in exhaustion, insisting he has got nothing left, only to pull another dose of heroic energy straight out of nowhere when circumstances suddenly require it. That, and the false promise of safety, happen often enough that you could probably make a drinking game out of them. Just please, please do not try to drink every time Kyle says or thinks that he needs to get home to his girls, or you will probably wake up in the hospital. Don't do that to yourself. Because of the unrelenting cadence of the second and third act, when the obligatory Christian chat scene appears, it feels a little bit like the drummer fumbled his sticks between beats. The big talk feels even odder than it often does in Christian fiction. Since this instance requires a sharp change of pace, in addition to the usual contrivance, and ends up feeling wedged in between moments of peril as well as cheesy. Yeah, eternity is more important than death, I get that, but that only explains why the Christian character is a participating half of this conversation. I still don't understand why the non-Christian is so receptive when he has serious, immediate other concerns. Why isn't he more worried about death than about eternity? Also, I feel compelled to ask, has no one in any Christian novel ever heard of praying silently? I think Beast is the third story I've read this year where the characters seem to think that prayer requires vibrating your vocal cords, even in situations where saving their breath would serve them better. I don't know. That's a whole other can of worms, though. On the whole, I have very few complaints about the action portion of Beast, and page-wise, that's most of the book, from about a third of the way in to a few pages from the end. It's sharp, it's quick, it's exciting, and it kept me reading. Unfortunately, it's always harder to elaborate on the good aspects of a work than the bad ones, but I do want to emphasize that I thought this was good. Beast is also a very clean technical read. I only noticed a few minor editing errors, and to be honest, I've seen worse mistakes in books from major publishing houses. So, I have no librarian rage to unleash on this text. Sorry, guys. No, the biggest problem that I have with Beast are rooted in that first act. So, let's talk a little more about that. The setting for this book is very accurate, at least as far as I've been able to determine, and it shows a lot of quality research. I definitely commend Carver for accuracy here, and for recruiting Anatra as his partner to that end. Unfortunately, that intensive research sometimes manifests itself in the book as intensive technobabble. Now, I'm a Star Trek fan, so I feel like I have a pretty high tolerance for technobabble, but the early chapters of Beast tested that. You got people talking about things like V-doors and monkey boards and bop panels, and they're always squeezing it in and tripping it out and trying to get to the shoe and bleeding the lizard, which sounds really dirty, but I'm sure it's actually not. In that same fan video of Carver's that I referenced earlier, he discussed how much Anatra contributed to the world building and the realism of the book, saying that he gave him co-author credit because several of the more jargon-heavy passages were written purely by Anatra and just edited by Carver to fit them into the larger story. And I have a quote from Carver here. "There are parts of this book that I really have no idea what's going on." Carver, I'm sorry, but that's not a good thing. If you, the author, do not know what is going on, what hope do I, the reader, have of ever figuring it out? I also noticed some abrupt shifts to present tense in the expository bits about the rig, which I assume is transcribed directly from Anatra's contributions, and I think that's another indication that these bits could have been improved by a little more trimming and polishing before being fitted into place in the story. Now, the technobabble, or as I like to call it in this case, mechnobabble, does rapidly fall away after the action kicks in around page 40. So if you can power through it for a little while, your perseverance will be rewarded. Some of Beast's other early quirks, though, are in fact there to stay. The marketing tagline for this book is "Man Up," and that's very apt. Just like End of the Innocents was clearly written by an evangelical for evangelicals, Beast is clearly written by men for men. This is a very masculine book, as in motor oil and raw steak manly. Now, obviously, I'm not a guy, but I am what my boyfriend calls a man's woman. I've always had hobbies and interests that tend to skew male, and because of that I've always had a lot of male friends. I am not a stranger to your dude culture, and I definitely don't want my books and movies to be all romantic entanglements and shopping montages. My boyfriend finds it both hilarious and awesome that I have never once asked him to watch a rom-com with me. He actually had to persuade me to watch one with him. So what I'm trying to get across here is that if even I feel like this book is a bit too macho and dudeish for me, I'm pretty confident that most other women, and probably even some men, are gonna feel the same way. This book is full of characters making various comments about things being too feminine. Rooms, shoes, human touch! Or how this job is too tough for most normal men. It doesn't take long for this to feel like a case of protesting too much to me. Both the characters and the narration seem to hold a certain amount of contempt for men regarded as insufficiently manly. For example, those inept in household repair, as well as for the 1%. The suits of the oil company are treated as heartless and contemptible, even though we see no evidence that they've actually done anything harmfully corrupt. The closest we get is one piece of fairly mild misconduct that gets revealed towards the end of the book. It's a small extra safety feature on the rig, available only to those in the know. But again, it doesn't hurt anyone, and I'm not sure that it would have been much help to the protagonists anyway. At any rate, I don't think it warrants the kind of disgust and accusations of "they're sitting there comfortably while good men die" that crop up in the later part of this book. If the author wanted us to get on board with those sentiments, I think he should have given us a little more narrative reason to. Now, this book is classified by the Crossover Alliance as a Blue Label book, which is their middle rating. But I don't really understand how they arrived at that determination. Why is this book Blue Label, but End of the Innocents White Label, when they seem, to me, to contain about the same amount and degree of edginess? Here in Beast, the sexuality is less intense than in End of the Innocents, but it's also more frequent. And you've got a lot more rough language in Beast, probably about the same amount of violence, so I don't understand why Beast gets a lower content rating. Is it because the only sex we actually see in Beast is within the context of marriage? Is it because the violence in Beast is primarily the result of accident rather than deliberate malice? Is it something else entirely? I don't know. Anybody who wants to explain this to me, please do so. I am genuinely interested in understanding the logic at work here. One of the edgiest things about this book, in my opinion, and the thing I'd be most concerned about a young person picking up from reading it, is the very rough, locker roomish atmosphere that this story floats in. Part of that is the characters swearing, frequently and creatively. I actually have the least concern about this aspect. This is classed as a book for older teens, and let's be honest, by the time your kids hit middle school, they already know all the cuss words. They probably know ones you don't. I don't think Beast is going to open any new cans of worms here, and I appreciate the willingness on the part of Carver and the Crossover Alliance to allow this sort of language in a Christian novel for the sake of verisimilitude. Another part of that atmosphere, though, is a blunt and pervasive sexuality, and I'm not so keen on that. Before reading Beast, I was under the impression that the whole men thinking about sex every 10 seconds thing was an urban legend, on par with you only use 10% of your brain. Now I'm not so sure. Until they get some immediate danger to otherwise occupy their brains, the guys in this book are constantly thinking and talking about sex. If they're not bragging about past sex, they're planning future sex, wanting sex, fantasizing about sex, joking about sex, lobbing sexually charged insults at each other. Even the oil rig itself is made into a giant sexual metaphor because, you see, it's humping the planet. Yes, yes, we get it. Sex. Thank you. Yes, that's enough. Guys, if this is really what it's like inside your skulls, I marvel that your half of the species accomplishes anything besides procreation. On top of the sexuality in general, there's even a little bit of the girls like bad boys trope thrown into Beast, which always makes me groan. Let me put this one straight right now. Stupid girls like bad boys. Smart ones, Know that kind and steady always beats brash and exciting in the long run. And the third part of that locker room atmosphere is stupid testosterone-fueled status games. Ugh. There's a lot of alpha dog posturing and dominance jockeying going on between these guys as they each strive to prove that they're the biggest, toughest, manliest man in the man pack of men. It gets old really fast. And I don't think that's just me being sexist, because I have an equal lack of patience for gossip mongering, false friendships, and similar stupid estrogen-fueled status games. I'd compare the male grandstanding in Beast to high school shenanigans, but one of the characters already did that for me. And just like how I felt about the teenage characters in End of the Innocents, while this may be very true to how rough men behave in the company of other rough men, it really does not endear any of these characters to me. On the one hand, I praise the accuracy, but on the other hand, those realistic aspects have me disliking the characters to the point that I don't much care whether they live or die, and that's not a recipe for an engaged reader. Speaking of who lives and who dies, I'm not going to spoil the ending of Beast for you, but I will say that it feels rushed and mismatched to me. The climax only resolves 4 pages from the end, which doesn't leave much space for things to wind down. And for as uber masculine as the story is, the ending feels awfully Hallmark Channel. Several conflicts seem to be just stamped resolved and never properly dealt with or explained. For example, one character has a major problem in his family that we're told at the end is okay now. We never learn what caused the rift in the first place or how it was dealt with, just that it was. This is a thing that kept these characters apart for years, but it's apparently fully healed over in a week or two, and the relationship is smooth again. No lingering awkwardness at all. I just found that implausible and disappointing. Let's talk about the characterization in Beast. It's pretty basic. Most of these guys only get a name, a job, and one defining trait, but since most of them are destined to become meat for the action grinder, you don't miss much from not knowing them better. And yes, the development allotted to any given character seems to be directly proportional to how long he's going to last, so it's not hard to guess who wears the red shirts on this rig. Off the rig, though, I do want to talk for a bit about the character of Kyle's wife, Jackie, because her character seems to be especially thin. I understand that she's only physically present in a few brief scenes, but she's the entire impetus for the plot. Kyle is doing everything that he does in this book out of love for her, and yet we know so little about her. Granted, like I said, she doesn't get much screen time, but even in what little time she has, I still see missed opportunities for characterization. Jackie has a scene about 3/4 of the way through the book, where she's watching Kyle's rig in flames on the nightly news. She goes to the phone, picks it up, dials a number, and that's it. We never learn who she called, what they said, what resulted from the conversation, all things that could have told us a lot about Jackie herself. I don't understand why this scene exists if not to expand her character, and yet it refuses to do that. I don't get why Carver showed us this to what seems like no purpose. Instead of telling us things we probably assumed anyway, like the disaster making the news or Jackie being upset by it, that time could have been better used to show us who Jackie is when Kyle's not around, where she draws her strength from, why she is worth everything that Kyle is going through. Kyle endures all this struggle, danger, and pain for her sake, but we don't get to know her well enough to understand why. I mean, yeah, she's his wife and he loves her, but again, why? What made him fall for her in the first place? What are her admirable qualities? We don't know. We don't even get much about her through Kyle's perspective. He clearly misses her, but that seems to be mostly in a sexual context. Kyle never seems to think about doing anything with her except sex. No memories of their old dates or shared projects or games with their little girl. Their whole relationship just feels so empty. They share a bed and a daughter, but it seems like little else. Their conversations are devoid of both chemistry and history. They don't seem to have any inside jokes, or recurring peeves, or corny nicknames, or any of the things that you see real couples develop. I don't know. Maybe because this book is meant for guys, the assumption is that men don't care about squishy relationship nonsense and don't want it clogging up their story, but I really felt the lack here. My favorite character in this book is probably Oscar. He's tough, he's smart, and he gets to accomplish enough that I feel like he deserves to share the hero spotlight with Kyle. He's not always the most pleasant person to be around, but you understand where his issues come from, and even his harshest moments feel born of hurt rather than of malice. He also seems to be the only character who gets to challenge Kyle and actually win, so major points for him there. My one complaint about him is that his backstory is inconsistent. We're told two different versions of his history at two different times, and while they're not completely irreconcilable, they do require some finagling to get them to line up with each other. My least favorite character in Beast is Johnny, but not for the reasons the author intended me to dislike him. We're apparently supposed to loathe Johnny's every utterance, and sure, his constant whining quickly becomes annoying, but some of his objections are actually quite understandable and even reasonable. Kyle hates and wants to punch Johnny for voicing the exact same sorts of thoughts that he himself has thought before, which, to my mind, says more unflattering things about Kyle than it does about Johnny. The most frustrating thing about Johnny, though, is the wasted potential that I see in him. I think he would have made a much more interesting antagonist as a matched foil for Kyle, rather than as a receptacle for all the reader's hate. At the beginning of the book, we learned that Johnny wanted the job that Kyle is stepping into, but was denied the promotion, and all the other characters agree that this was the correct decision. Johnny did not deserve that promotion. Johnny is a useless waste of skin who screws up everything, and the only one who can't see that is Johnny himself. But think how much more interesting the character interactions could have been if that wasn't the case. What if Johnny did have a good reason to expect he'd be promoted? Then he could have a real, legitimate reason to dislike Kyle, rather than just being the jerk who hates the hero for being the hero. Rather than clearly right and awesome versus clearly wrong and pathetic, we could have a more engaging, evenly matched antagonism between these two characters. Maybe Carver just wanted to keep the secondary conflict very basic, to better focus on the action and survival elements of the book, but even as a stock character, Johnny feels odd. Traditionally, when you have a character like this in a survival story, the guy who's a complete jerk and an unmitigated tool, he's destined for either a karmic death or an 11th hour redemption. Johnny doesn't get either of those, and that confuses me. Carver writes him as such a formulaic character, but then doesn't use him according to the formula, so I don't even know what to call that. Whatever it is, it didn't work for me. Now, I debated whether I wanted to talk about this last subject for a while, but I decided to go ahead with it because I do think it's something that could impact others' enjoyment of the book. Character likability is such a subjective concept. The very same traits that make a character so beloved by reader A can make him aggravating to reader B. What I call perseverance, you might call pig-headed stubbornness. I say brave, you say foolhardy. A lot of personality traits can be read either way like that. And while there are a number of authorial tools to make a character more sympathetic or admirable, it's probably impossible to create a universally appealing character. That said, the sad fact is, I just don't like Kyle. He's definitely got some admirable qualities. He's brave. He's clearly very devoted. He's a little arrogant, but then he does have accomplishments to back it up, so it's not entirely unwarranted. So why do I feel this way about him? I thought it over for a while, went back and reread some chapters. until finally I was able to identify what bothered me. Like I said earlier, I've had a lot of male friends in my life, but Kyle does not remind me of the guys I hung out with in high school and college. Kyle reminds me of the guys who mocked, harassed, and occasionally beat up the guys I hung out with. Kyle is a willing participant in those stupid testosterone-fueled status games I mentioned. On several occasions, he does things to deliberately assert his dominance. Shoving his way up through a crowd, for example, or taking his sweet time getting out of the way. During the crisis, he uses intimidation and the threat of violence to compel others to follow his orders, even when their going another way wouldn't make any difference to his group. Kyle seems to be a big fan of winning debates with argumentum ad baculum. Now, if you're not familiar with that strategy, it's the one where I win because I'll punch you if you say I don't. Also, while Kyle is certainly willing to sacrifice for those he loves, he seems oddly insensitive to their needs. When his parents' more distant method of showing support makes his wife uncomfortable, he apparently doesn't do anything to ameliorate that. He knows they really care, so why doesn't she? There's no indication that he tries explaining his family to Jackie, or asking his parents to step out of their comfort zone, or anything like that. He thinks things about his wife like her needing to, quote, learn the consequences of riling him up like she did last night, end quote. Now, granted, that's in a sexual context, but I gotta be honest with you guys, when I read those words, I winced. That phrasing made me pretty uncomfortable. And possibly the worst instance of this comes in a scene where Kyle is Skyping with his wife. They discuss her breast cancer, they talk about how she's been feeling, talk through her worries a little bit, and then, only 5 lines later, Kyle says, "Hey baby, flash me your boobs." It just seems so jarringly callous of him. He gave her some emotional support, so now it's her turn to give him what he wants. And it's not just his wife that he seems to lack empathy for. There's a scene about halfway through the book where Kyle convinces 3 other guys to lower him and a wounded man he's carrying down the side of the rig on a fire hose. Now he knows that by doing this, these 3 other men may be sacrificing their opportunity to escape themselves. And yet, as he makes his way down, he thinks about these guys contemptuously. These guys who may well die for him. And worse, when one of them does end up dying after all, he doesn't regret that thought. Now, I know he's got other things on his mind, but still, these are not the sort of thoughts and actions that tell my instincts, this is the good guy. I'm okay with the hero who's not a paragon, who has failings and flaws, but part of the problem is that I don't think the author regards these characteristics as flaws in Kyle. I see them as bugs, but he seems to see them as features. And again, this is largely personal and subjective, but I think that many geeks who grew up as geeks, who had bad experiences with the guys like the guys in this book, are going to feel the same way as I do. It won't matter how many times Carver has the other characters remind them that Kyle is awesome, they're still going to see him as a jerk. So, unfortunately, I think that a lot of the sort of people that are readers of the Crossover Alliance in general may not be able to connect with Beast in the way that the author intended. Now, if you are the target demographic of Beast, if you're a blue-collar conservative male Christian, you will probably love it. If you're not, you can definitely still give it a try, and you'll probably find something to like in it, but you'll also probably find a lot that you don't. Beast knows what it is, and it's not shy about it. Besides, we geeks aren't the only ones the Christian market tends to overlook. In a world where most Christian books are marketed at your mom and your grandma, it's good that Mark Carver is out there writing books for your dad and your brother. He's clearly a very talented author, and while I think his work is too strong a taste to ever go mainstream, I think that within the niche he's chosen for himself, he'll do well. His fan base might stay small, but I think it'll also stay very loyal. Beast hits the mark it aims for, and even if that mark is miles away from where I'm standing, I have to give it fair credit for that. So, overall, I give Beast a quality score of 8 out of 10. I feel like it's well done, again, at what it is trying to be. It may not be particularly remarkable, but it is good and solid. And in relevance, I give this book a score of 7 out of 10. There is a strong theme of sacrificial love throughout the book, but Beast doesn't really have much to say about it. There are also a few mentions of the Bible and prayer present, but they're cursory and unspecific. And that obligatory evangelism scene I mentioned earlier rushes across the stage so quickly you might blink and miss it, so none of those elements are likely to spark much discussion. Beast is available from either Amazon or the Crossover Alliance website. It's $13 for the trade paperback or $4 for the ebook edition. You can learn more about Beast, the author Mark Carver, and the Crossover Alliance in general either by going to their website or by the link below the video. So if this sounds like the book for you, go snap it up, and more power to you, man, or possibly woman, but like I said, unlikely. It's just not going to be the book for me, unfortunately. So, happy reading, guys, and I'll talk to you another time.
ChristianGeekCentral.com